Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Today, we finish up learning how to use your mode jam tape and then move on to look at other scales and mode systems. This set of diatonic modes that we've been looking at is not the only set that there is. Any pattern of intervals can generate a system of modes. You'll be needing your mode jam tape, your musical slide rule, and your color-coded scale finger charts for today's lesson. This is lesson 20, so make sure your booklet is open to page 20. All set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. Got a lot to talk about again today, another big show. We're right in the thick of it here with this whole stuff about diatonic harmony. Remember, just to quickly remind ourselves of where we're at, remember this argument between these three guys. Wow, I can play one scale over several chords. No, when the chord changes, so must the scale change. Remember, there's a separate scale for each chord in the song. But how can both these things be true? Well, that's what the whole world of modes is all about, because it turns out that the same set of notes is several different scales. It just depends on which note in the set that you decide to start on. Each one of these modes has a chord embedded inside it, and that's what explains an awful lot about these conventional chord progressions we've been looking at. For example, this progression here, which I'm sure you've seen dozens of songs: G major, C major, D major, E minor, and A minor. Now, what we're trying to learn right now is we're looking at this mode jam tape that we made. In order to construct melodies, particularly if you're writing songs or if you're improvising, you have to be really in touch with how the different scales in these mode systems relate to the different chords in the chord progression. And we found out that this, I'm not going to bother to review that stuff now because we just don't have time to do that today, but what we're finishing up right now is we're looking at how to use your mode jam tape in order to experiment with how these scales relate to chords. Now, when we left off last week, we were looking at this key right here, which, let me flip this around so we don't get our eye distracted by this. We were looking at this key to understand your mode jam tape. Remember, your mode jam tape is a series of different chord progressions that they're like broken down into just two chord progressions. So you never have more than two scales to look at. You never have more than two chords to look at. What I was working with last week was progression number 1 here, which was this 1-4 progression. Remember, all of these are in the key of A. So what I was playing was the 1 chord, which is A major, and the 4 chord, which was D major. And you're using, therefore, two different scales. You're using mode number 1, which is the Ionian mode, and then you're using the mode that starts on the 4th note of the major scale, which is the 4th mode, which is Lydian. And we are using this mode jam tape 3 different ways. We're using it to just listen to chord progressions and how the scales relate to them. We're also looking at our finger charts, and let me hold up one of these first in total. Remember, this is, for example, here's the finger chart for your major diatonic scale itself, also known as the Ionian mode. Remember, we have 12 different ways to play the scale, and each one has an ascending and descending aspect to it, whether you're doing your finger shifts with your index finger, in which case the dots, you would use the dots on this upper gray fret here, or whether you're doing the notes that are outside of the 4 frets with your pinky. Pinky shifts are these notes down here. And so going up the scale, you tend to use these more. Going down the scale, you tend to use the ones that are on the lower fret more. Now, what we suggested last week is that you make a copy of these different scale charts and then chop them up into flashcards. And what I was showing you last week is that in this first progression here, in this 1-4 progression, since you're using Ionian and Lydian, you're going to want to be looking at your Ionian and your Lydian flashcards. Now, you've got 12 of these to work your way through. And just to remind you with the Ionian stuff, now, for example, here's an Ionian. This is Ionian number 4. Remember, each one has a little number here. If you were going to be learning Ionian number 4, then you'd take Ionian 4, but you would also select Lydian number 4, and you can put them up right next to each other on your music stand or whatever you're looking at. If we could just look at these for a moment and remind ourselves that, remember, the dots are in exactly the same place. This finger pattern is exactly the same for A Ionian and D Lydian. So the dots are in the same place. I'm not talking about the color of the dots. That's the whole point here. Notice that the dots have all changed color. That's because the root note is not in the same place. Even though you're playing the same notes, they are not functioning the same way, depending on what chord you play over them. In the Ionian mode, in number 4 here, your root note is under your third finger on your low E string. These, of course, are just octave notes of that note right there. If you want to play a major scale that way, notice that you have a whole bunch of finger shifts to do. So this isn't necessarily one that I recommend that you start working on right away. As I said before, one of the best things you can do is simply start with the easy ones, the ones that have no finger shifts or only have 1 or 2 finger shifts. Then you work your way up to these more complex ones. Since we are working on our first progression here, this 1-4 progression, it's the Ionian and Lydian finger charts that you're going to be using. And remember, what I was suggesting was, as you look at these, and just let me go to a simpler one here so as not to get you thinking that this is some horribly complicated deal. You're going to work your way into these more complicated ones later on. But here's number 10, Ionian 10, and we'll also find Lydian 10 in here. Notice this is one of the 2 ways to play a major scale that have no finger shifts in them at all. Everything can exist right within 4 frets. No fingerings on these gray frets where you have to do your finger shifts. Now, notice how, in this case, your root note is right there. And in this case, even though the dots are in the same place, the red dot has moved over to the next string over. It's now on your D string. It's on the same fret. What interval exists between those 2 notes right there? Well, they're on the same fret on adjacent strings. Hopefully you remember from our discussion on intervals that that's an interval of a perfect 4th. So what that means is if that's the root note of your 1 chord, it's no surprise at all that that note right there would be the root note of your 4 chord. What that also means is this scale is the 4th mode of this scale right here. And what I encouraged you to do last week, looking at this first progression on your tape, was to actually say and sing the notes. Would be the ultimate thing you can do. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. I think a lot of you will start off by not doing that, but later on, when you really find out how significant all this ear training stuff is, you're probably going to want to be doing that. Oh, the other thing I need to remind you is whenever you're using, with this jam tape here, which is in the key of A, whenever you're using one of those charts right there, the Ionian root note, the root note for the Ionian scale, which in number 10 here, for example, is that dot right there. That note has to be an A, doesn't it? Because that's what it means to play in the key of A. So in this particular case here, you've got to find the location on the neck to use the correct flashcard to be in the key of A. In this one right here, your pinky is playing the root note, and that's on your A string. So where is your hand going to have to be on the neck of the guitar in order to use this finger chart to play in the key of A? Your pinky is going to have to be on an A. Since that is your A string, there's only one place you're going to be able to do that, and that's with your pinky up here on the 12th fret, because that's the octave note, of course, of the open string. So you'll be using to play in the key of A, you'll be using number 10. You'll be using chart number 10 with your pinky up here on the 12th fret. And then if you just follow that pattern of dots, that's an A major scale. A Ionian. And one of the best things you can do is actually hum, do a little ear training on your own. Hum, sing to yourself, say the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can listen to what each individual note sounds like 1, 3, 4, 5, and you can listen to how those notes relate to the chord. That is the secret to being able to construct interesting and successful melodies when you're improvising. Now, when you go to the fourth mode, the only thing that's happened is you're playing exactly the same note, you're using exactly the same finger pattern, but now this note on your D string, the root note was right there, but now the root note has moved up an interval of a fourth, and you're playing the Lydian mode. You could sing those notes to yourself. 1, 2, 3, sharp, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, 7, 6, 5, sharp, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that's the scale you're playing over the 4 chord in this progression. Now, that's where we left off last time. Ultimately, it would be great if you could figure out how to use all 12 of your Ionian and Lydian charts to play in the key of A. What that means is you're going to be playing all over the neck. So, if Do is under this finger, say, on your D string, you're going to have to find where there's an A on your D string, and that would be right here. So, for example, with your third finger on your 7th fret, you know what I mean? It's just that you're going to be playing using 12 different fingerings. There's a way for you to play an A major scale anywhere on any fret up and down the neck. That's real power if you can control the fretboard of the guitar on that level. As I said before, I suggest just starting off with the easy ones, and over a period of years. Remember, this is going to take you years to get to be really good at controlling all this stuff. Now, where we left off last week was to suggest that on your mode jam tape, we don't just have this 1-4 progression. We also have several other progressions. I don't have time really to talk about all of them, but let's just start. Let's just look at this second progression on here. You've got about 4 minutes of this second progression, which isn't a 1-4 progression. It's a 1-5 progression. That means in the key of A. If you remember, you might want to set your slide rule up to be in the key of A while you're looking at the video right now. Remember, that just means putting A in window number 1. You notice your 1 chord is A major and your 5 chord is E major. That means you're going to be playing A Ionian and E Mixolydian here. We're not going to be using the Lydian flashcards this time. We're going to be using the Mixolydian flashcards, and that's your 5th mode of the major scale right there. Now, I'm going to play this progression now. This is a different progression. It's a little rockier than the other one. You'll hear there's distortion on the guitars and stuff. I tried with these different progressions to shake it up so it doesn't get too boring. Your last one was a little more of a kind of a middle-of-the-road chord progression. This is a little more hard rocky. When I did this, I was kind of thinking, well, maybe this sounded sort of like something the Rolling Stones would do or something like that, with distortion on the guitars. And let's take a look and a listen at this progression. Now, here, since this is a 1-5 progression, we're not going to be using our Lydian flashcards anymore. We're going to be using Ionian again, but this time we're going to be using our Mixolydian flashcards. Now let's take one that we haven't done before, just so once again we can look at these. I'm going to pick one that's not too hard. Like here, for example, here's number 1. Now, so I'm going to select Ionian 1, and I'm also going to select Mixolydian number 1. Because remember, you're always using like numbers when you do this. If you do that, you will notice that the finger patterns are exactly the same. Try putting these down here. I hope it doesn't disappear below the rim there too much. But if we look at those 2 finger charts right there, once again, we see that the dots are in exactly the same place. The only thing that's changed is the coloring of the dots. That's because when you play over the 1 chord and then you play over the 5 chord, each one of these notes, even though they're the same notes, they have a totally different relationship with the chord. In this one right here, notice there's the root note right there, Ionian, and it's under my index finger, but it's actually a finger reach itself out of the box down there. In this particular example, in the key of A, that note is going to have to be an A then, right there. Now, that's the root note of the Ionian mode. The Mixolydian is the 5th mode. So what that means is the root note of that, which is that red dot right there, has got to be an interval of a perfect 5th above that root note right there. For example, see that blue dot in this pattern right there? You might recall, if you remember your color coding, that blue is the 5th, isn't it? So that's 1, and that interval is a perfect 5th, so that's got to be note number 5. In the 5th mode, that turns out to be the new root note. Not only that, if you remember, Mixolydian is a major scale, but it also has a flat 7 in it. So if you look back here at your chart again, you'll notice, see, violet is note number 7, isn't it, in our color coding system. Notice how it's got a little flat sign in it. These, of course, are just octave versions of that same note right there. And so you can see a major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, except right here you've got your flatted 7, only a half step above 6. Now, listen to this chord progression here. I'm going to put a little distortion on the guitar here. And now, let me just play the progression for a moment and have you notice where the 1 chord and the 5 chord actually begin. Take a second for the tape. Now, here we are. We're on the 1 chord. Little distortion on the guitar. This is A major. Now, here's the 5 chord. Hear the chord change? This is the 5 chord in this key. Now here we go back to the 1 chord, back to A again. Now, if I'm going to use this finger pattern right here, I have to be in the key of A. Notice that the original root note is a index finger reach out of the box. So that means on the neck of my guitar right here, A is this 5th fret on my low E string. So my hand position for this box is going to be so that my index finger is 1 fret below that, but I'm going to be reaching out that extra fret in order to get that root note right there. And then if we look at this finger chart right down here, here's the finger pattern for that scale. Now notice that this sounds like an A major scale. I'll wait for the A chord to come around. Here it comes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, when I go to the next one, when the E chord comes around, I'm using this box. Oops. Oop, I can't think and do both at the same time. Here I go. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now the second box, the Mixolydian mode. Oops. Now back to the A. Now here's the E. Now back to the A again. And again, the more I can kind of sing and say the numbers as I play them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the using it to play the Mixolydian mode. Oh man, I'm doing terrible, aren't I? It's hard to do like 5 different things all at once. But that's how to use these flashcards. You've got once again with the 1-5 progression, you've got 12 different fingerings for this chord. Remember, this one happens to be just number 1. So we've chosen Ionian 1 and we've chosen Mixolydian 1. But in the next example, here's another one. Let's choose Ionian number, let's see, how about number, here's number 8. So I choose Ionian 8 and I also choose Mixolydian 8. Once again, you notice that these 2 finger charts have their dots in exactly the same place. These are exactly the same notes. And It's just that over the different chords in the chord progression, they're going to be functioning differently. But notice the dots are in the same place. Once again, here's the root note for the Ionian mode, and this has to be an A, doesn't it? So where is that going to be? Well, it's under your second finger, notice, and it's on your A string. So that means your second finger is going to have to be on your 12th fret, your octave fret of A, in order to play that scale. Now, a fifth above that is this blue dot, isn't it? So we would expect that that's where the root note is going to be for the Mixolydian mode, and indeed, there it is right there. The root note of this scale is an interval above, of a perfect fifth above the root note of this scale. And once again, we've got and now we're up here, because remember, of the Ionian mode, the red dot has to be on an A. It's your second finger, so I'm up here on my 12th fret with my second finger. I'm playing an A major scale. I can go a partial way down into a lower octave. Now, if I start here, oops, right there with my pinky right on that, and this is my pinky now playing an E on my D string. That will be the 14th fret. If I use this box to play that scale, notice how my index finger is a finger shift or finger reach out of the box. That would be playing that flat 7 note right there, which is, after all, is the characteristic note that separates the Mixolydian mode. Remember, Mixolydian is a major scale with a flatted 7. If I use these dots, starting with my pinky on the 14th fret on my D string, I am using this exact same finger chart right here to play both an A major scale, which is just 1 through 8, and I'm also playing E Mixolydian with my pinky on the 14th fret right there, and with the flatted 7 in the scale. Just a little bit more of the music here. Here's the A major scale, and here's the E Mixolydian. Now here's the A major again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Oh, and here's the E again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. Hear that flat 7? You've heard that note a million times. It's a very bluesy note. And so that's how you're going to use your mode jam tape. It's kind of hard to explain the whole thing. The more you work with it, the more you'll absolutely figure out once and for all yourself how to use it. Now, remember, we said the most common chord progression of all times was a 1-4-5 progression, right? Well, we're just breaking this down into slightly more, chunks that you can manage. Instead of throwing a whole bunch of chords and a whole bunch of scales at you at once, on your mode jam tape, you're always just dealing with 2 different scales. And most of the time, we're actually starting with the Ionian mode right there, and then we're moving to some other chord. But if we combine the thinking of these 2 modes of these 2 chord progressions right here, there's your 1-4-5 progression. So if you're playing a 1-4-5 progression, you're just using thinking from both of these different ways, and eventually, you can make your own jam tapes in the end. Hopefully, as a musician, you'll figure out some way to record yourself on tape, and then you can make all the jam tapes you want. In fact, if you're in a band, one of the most valuable things you can do is get enough recording equipment at least. So let's say you're the lead guitar player in the band, and the band is expecting you to do a guitar solo. They're not going to want you taking up rehearsal time to practice creating your melodies, to practice improvising. So one of the best things you can do is learn to make your own mode jam tapes. Just record over and over again the chord progression in the guitar solo part of the song, and then you can sit there for hours in your room with your finger charts out and your slide rule, and just practice learning how to construct different melodies over jam tapes that you make yourself. But here's your first jam tape that you'll really be able to get something out of, which is the one that you've got with your package of information here. Now, we have still a couple more progressions. I'm not going to take any more time to demonstrate these. I'm pretty sure you will be able to figure out how to use these other progressions on the basis of knowing how to use these first 2. Our third progression, which goes on for somewhere in the vicinity of 4 minutes on your tape, is, remember we said this after a 1-4-5 progression, what is the number of the next most common chord in the chord progression. Remember, we said it was the sixth chord. It was that relative minor chord. It's a relative, it's the whole concept of relative minor involves the sixth degree of the scale. So our third progression is a 1-6 progression right here. From in the key of A, that means we're going to go from A major to F sharp minor. If you look at your slide rule there, you will see that F sharp is the sixth degree of the A major scale. And since it's the relative minor, and since that's the Aeolian mode, which we know is a minor scale, we're not at all surprised to find out that we're going to be playing an F sharp minor chord. This is the first of our chord progressions on the page here, which actually involves a minor chord. So with this one, you're going to be using A Ionian. And then you're not going to be using your Lydian flashcards. You're not going to be using your Mixolydian flashcards. You're going to be using Aeolian, because that is the sixth mode of the major scale right there. Just like with the other two progressions, you've got 12 different fingerings. So you're going to choose Ionian number 7, and you're going to choose Aeolian number 7, and you're going to put them right next to each other. You're going to notice the dots are in exactly the same place. That is, it's exactly the same notes. They're just functioning different. Remember, that is so important. People go, why can't I just think like I'm playing the same scale? Why can't I just think like I'm playing an A major scale the whole time? Why is it important for me to understand that I'm actually playing two different scales? The answer is, yeah, they're exactly the same notes, but they are each going to sound completely different depending on which chord you play them over. And that is, if you ask me, what separates the people who really can, really just have all kinds of interesting and emotional things happen in their solos, and then the people that just bore you to death because they're just playing the same old dumb notes that you've heard a million times before. It's a long road to hoe. It's going to take you a couple of years to actually get to where you can control music on that level, but hey, you knew this wasn't going to happen overnight, right? Now, your fourth progression on this chart is a little bit different. This one is going to be a double minor. You're going to be playing both of your chords in the progression are going to be minor chords. There's two ways of looking at this. One way is we could look at it as being a 6-2 progression in the key. And remember, I'm using lowercase Roman numerals here because both of these are going to turn out to be minor chords. And since this is the sixth chord, the relative minor, it's not A anymore. It's the same one that was over here. It's F sharp minor. And then this is the 2 mode, which is in the key of A. You'll notice if you look at your slide rule is B, and since that's Dorian mode, you know that that's also a minor chord. Dorian is a minor scale, so the chord that goes along with it is a minor chord. So you're going to be playing a chord progression that goes from F sharp minor to B minor. If you listen to the tape, you can. I'm sure you know how to play these chords at this point too, so you can check, and if you want to, just play the chords along with the progression a couple of times to figure out where the F sharp ends and the B minor begins. I tried to make it as obvious as I could on the tape. So here you're going to be using Aeolian again. And here, you're going to be using Dorian. So now, in this case, interestingly enough, you're not going to be using your Ionian charts at all. This is the first time, and you're actually going to be using Aeolian and Dorian charts or flashcards for this right here. The other thing I want to remind you of is notice here, unlike any of the progressions that you saw before, in which case you always had an A present, the one chord was always an A, here it's F sharp minor. There is no A in this progression, is there? So what that means is when you choose one of your Aeolian charts to use, now just because it happens to be on top here, here's number 10, and so we've got Aeolian 10, and we've also got Dorian 10 in here somewhere. The thing to remember is, as in all the other examples, we always were looking for an A, weren't we? Because the root note, when we used the Ionian mode, since we're in the key of A, was always A. But now we are not using the Ionian flashcards at all. So if we look at this example right here, here's Aeolian 10 and here's Dorian 10. So once again, here's another set of charts you're going to be looking at here, and here's Aeolian 10, here's Dorian 10. Now in this particular case, since this is not the Ionian mode, this is the Aeolian mode, In this case, you are not going to be choosing that note right there as an A. This is different than the other ones because we're not doing Ionian anymore. This is, remember, F sharp Aeolian. So this note right here has to be an F sharp. It's under your index finger and it's on your A string. Where do you find an F sharp on your A string? Give you a second to think about it. If you want to pause the tape, you could actually think about it. But actually, I'll show you in a second where it is. So unlike the other chord progressions, when you're using your Aeolian in this case, this is not going to be an A. This is going to be an F sharp. Then that turns out that this, then, the root note of the Dorian, turns out is going to automatically become a B because, remember, our chord progression is actually F sharp minor to B minor. So in order to use these particular charts here, where am I going to be on the neck? If my index finger has to be playing an F sharp note on my A string, you will notice that that's at the 9th fret. So in order to use this particular set of boxes, I'm going to be up with my index finger on the 9th fret and then playing this pattern. Now listen, I'll just play the Aeolian mode right here and listen to how this actually, again, it's going to not sound completely alien to you. You've heard these scales a million times, but this might be the first time you've ever been really introduced to actually thinking about playing them. Aeolian mode goes 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. You can also go another octave with this. Have to reach out of the box to get the octave note. This is a minor scale, isn't it? Sounds sad. Meant to go with minor chords. Once again, Aeolian 10, Dorian 10. You've got 12 of these finger boxes to work your way through, and in each case, with the Aeolian one, your index finger has got to be playing an F sharp. For this one, it's your index finger on your A string, which is up at the 9th fret. In all of these other cases, your root note has been an A, but in this one, it's different. It's an F sharp, and that's because it's not the Ionian mode, it's the Aeolian mode. Now, there is one more chord progression that I included on your Mode Jam tape. Notice how over the course of this Mode Jam tape, we have investigated all of the relationships that are the really most common ones. 1, 4, 5. Of course, we said, which is everybody's heard of these 1, 4, 5 progressions. But remember, 1, 4, 5 is only part of a larger system. How does the large system go? It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 4, 5 just turn out to be arguably the most common. Those are also the major ones, aren't they? Lydian and Mixolydian are major scales, whereas when we get down to here, we start seeing the minor ones. The 6 is the relative minor. It's a minor scale. It's a minor chord. Aeolian. Dorian is the 2. B minor is the 2 chord in the key of A and is therefore a minor chord because the Dorian, being the 2 mode, is a minor scale. So look at all the different chord relationships we've learned. 1, 4, 5, 6, 2. There are other chord scale relationships out there, but it's just, like I said, you'll make your own Mode Jam tapes over time in order to investigate these. We only have a limited amount of time here, and so you know, just work with these because these are absolutely the most common ones. There, as I started to say a moment ago, there is one more progression that we've included on your Mode Jam tape. We are going to be talking about what to do with this progression a little bit further down the road when we talk about blues. By the way, we are going to be talking about that. I know a lot of you are interested in blues music. I know a lot of you are interested in hard rock type music, which happens to have a more of a bluesy kind of edge to it. Blues harmony is a departure from diatonic harmony. It has certain elements of diatonic harmony in it, but it also has some rather interesting variations in there that don't happen in diatonic music. So just to mention, you do have a 1-4-5 blues chord progression on your Mode Jam tape, but and you could experiment with that at this point now if you wanted to too, of course, but you might want to put that off until we actually talk about blues harmony. So your last chord progression is a 1-4-5 kind of blues progression, and you'll notice that that is also in the key of A, and that goes on for about four minutes on your tape too. If you get to the end of the 4 minutes and you still want to play some more, just rewind the tape back to the beginning of whatever progression you're working on and just keep going. Now, the last thing I want to tell you is two things about this Mode Jam tape, which is this. Two things. Resist the temptation to get bored with your Mode Jam tape. You're going to. After you've played it 100 times, you're going to be going, oh, God, I'm so sick of this. But resist the temptation to get bored with it, because what I'm going to suggest is if you're starting to get bored with your Mode Jam tape, one of the main reasons that is your playing has gotten boring. And you're just doing the same things over and over again relative to this jam tape. That's, in a sense, all the more reason to pull it out one more time and stick it in the machine. Try something new with the scales you're playing. And every now and then, some new little combination of notes that hasn't occurred to you to use before is actually going to come into your head, and it's going to make the whole thing interesting over and over again. Now, let me ask you this. You're playing like these very simple chord progressions right now. 5 years from now, are you going to be playing any different chord progressions than this? Well, in a way, the answer is yes. Hopefully 5 years from now, you'll be into more sophisticated music, which has even more different types of chord progressions on it. But that doesn't mean you're not going to be still playing these same chord progressions 5 years from now. So and let's say you're in a band 5 years from now, you might be playing the same songs you're playing today, and the same thing is true again. You might be going, oh my God, I'm so bored with playing this song. But then again, you got to get up there tonight and hopefully give them something new that they haven't heard before. So you might as well just stick with this tape and just keep going. If you're getting bored with it, it's because your playing has gotten boring. Haul it out, stick it in, pull your flashcards out again, and just try to find some new approach to it. And I guarantee you will. It happens to me all the time. Happened to me not too long ago on some of my jam tapes with some of the tunes I'd written. There was one in particular I was getting just sick of because I'd played it a million times. And all of a sudden I noticed this one little trick, this one little combination of notes that I either I just hadn't really experienced it before. And all of a sudden it opened up a whole new way of thinking for me. And the whole song just like in an instant just became interesting to play again. So resist the temptation to get bored with this tape. The other thing is resist the temptation to just jam. Don't just jam. I mean, that's the fun part. Don't just jam. By all means, do some of that. Have fun with it. That's what this is all about, having fun. But you will have more fun when you've actually mastered these scales. Both mastered them by ear and also mastered all the various finger patterns. Once you get to that point where you know these scales by how they sound and you know the finger patterns just without even having to think of them, that is total freedom on your instrument. And if you think you're having fun now, you are destined to have 100 times more fun than you could possibly imagine with this stuff if you just do the grunt work in the beginning. We've said that so many times. A little bit of disciplined work will get you to places that right now you might not even be able to dream of that you'd get to. So don't just jam. Learn your scales. You've got 12 different finger variations with all the different finger shifts, pinky shifts, and index shift versions of these different scales. Don't just jam. Make sure you actually learn the scales. And the other thing, of course, to really 100% nail this stuff so that you're doing the absolute best work you can do with these scales is, as I mentioned before, sing, say the numbers. You can stop and dwell on different notes and actually listen to what they sound like relative to the chords you're playing. So the grunt work kind of variation on this stuff is don't just jam, learn the scales, do a certain amount of grunt work every day, sing and say the numbers as you play them. In Aeolian mode up here, I'd be going 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8, 8, flat 7, flat 6, 5, 4, flat 3, 2, 1. I just sang that scale essentially, pretty much perfectly well. I have ear trained all these scales. I know what they all sound like. How did I do it? With my Mode Jam tape. That's one of the best vehicles you have for exploring this stuff. There you go. Now, I hope I managed to mention that enough. I hope I managed to get you how to understand that. I think if you go back and review these tapes, you'll get to the point where you absolutely understand that. A lot of times I can't really tell here in the studio. If I have a student in front of me, then I can, they'll go, no, I didn't get that, and I can go back and repeat it again. But hopefully I managed to explain how this whole thing works right there. You've got these 5 different progressions that you'll be experimenting with using your various Mode Jam flashcards of the different scales. Okay, now we've got quite a bit of time left today, and we are on to another subject right now, and this is it's kind of like the next step beyond diatonic harmony. And so we'll get rid of this chart here for right now and take one last look at this, just to remind ourselves of what the subject that we're leaving right now. This whole subject of diatonic harmony, which is all about the major scale and its 7 modes and what chords are embedded in there. Remember, we said 50% of the songs you're ever going to play work that way. But it's only 50%. Remember, there's a lot of other ways that scale chord relationships are organized besides this diatonic harmony type stuff. And you might recall back when we first looked at our must-know list of scales, you might recall that I said I am aware of somewhere in the vicinity of 60 to 70 different types of scales. Now, we haven't looked at all of those at that point. All we've looked at so far are the scales that are on this chart right here, which you might recall is like 3 hours ago, what I call the must-know list of scales. And you'll recognize all your diatonic modes are here, plus melodic minor and harmonic minor, which we haven't talked much about yet. Your pentatonic scales are here, which we haven't talked about yet. Whole tone and diminished scales are here. But these are only 14 scales, and I'm saying that I'm aware of dozens and dozens more scales than this. Now, a lot of these scales, other scales, are what we might call ethnic scales. And you'll notice that you have a chart in your support material there, which has a number of these ethnic scales, scales from different cultures around the planet. Japanese scales, Chinese scales, Hungarian scales, Gypsy scales, Byzantine scales, Persian scales, Spanish scales, on and on and on. These are very interesting patterns to examine, and if you keep going in music, you will get to a point where you may find it very interesting to know about all these various scales too. You occasionally see usages of these in Western popular music, but they aren't all that common, and it's kind of beyond the scope of this program to really look at all those scales on there. But I just want to show you some of the other scales that aren't on the must-know list that over the next few years you owe it to yourself to kind of learn something about. And so we're going to be looking at these other scales. And any given scale has the potential of generating a system of modes. Remember what we learned about our diatonic modes. We took the pattern of intervals that is a major scale, and we discovered that if we just started on different notes in the sequence, that they became a completely different scale with a completely different sound. Sometimes they were happy-sounding major things. Sometimes they were sad-sounding minor things. But any pattern of intervals has the potential of being a scale, and any scale has the potential of generating a system of modes. It's just that sometimes this is not meaningful to talk about. For example, let's look up here at the chart up here and look at a chromatic scale. Remember, chromatic scale was that scale, the very first one we learned. It was when you play all 13 notes and they're all separated by half steps, right? Each of the notes in a chromatic scale is separated by a half step. Now let me ask you this question. Does a chromatic scale have modes? And the answer is, well, I suppose yes, it does. Any scale has modes. You could take this chromatic scale and you could start on the second note right there and play until you got up to an octave up above of that. And you could start on the third note of your chromatic scale right here on the chart. And you could go up till you came to an octave above that. But is it meaningful to talk about the modes of a chromatic scale? And the answer to my mind is kind of like no, because if you looked at all these different modes of a chromatic scale, wouldn't they all just still be chromatic scales? I mean, if we look at the modes of a chromatic scale, are we going to discover any new patterns of intervals? So there's two ways of describing the modes of a chromatic scale. One way is to suggest that, like, any scale, the chromatic scale has modes. How many does it have? Well, maybe it's fair to say that it has 12. But really, wouldn't they all be the same? Wouldn't the 12 modes of a chromatic scale still be a chromatic scale? So maybe it's more accurate to say that a chromatic scale has modes. How many modes does it have? It really only has one. So it's not going to be meaningful for us to talk about the modes of a chromatic scale. If we look down here at a whole tone scale, which is all whole steps, same thing again. Does a whole tone scale have modes? Well, I suppose, but wouldn't they just all be the same anyway? So let's not talk about whole tone scale modes. So what other scales on this page are going to generate meaningful systems of modes that it might be interesting for us to look at? Well, how about this scale, right? Actually, let's look at this one first. How about the pentatonic scale? The pentatonic scale down here, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. Would a pentatonic scale have modes? Well, the answer is yes. Now, how many modes would it have? Well, generally speaking, a scale has as many modes as there are notes within the scale. So theoretically, since there's 5 notes in a pentatonic scale, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Remember, there's 6 notes if you include the octave note up there at the top. But a pentatonic scale goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. Notice these lines here. That's what indicates. Remember, the other thing about pentatonic scales is they have step and a half intervals in them. Notice how a pentatonic scale has no half steps. It's whole steps between a lot of the notes, and then in two places in this scale, you have step and a half intervals. Does a pentatonic scale have modes? Yes, it does. And the first new set of modes that we're going to look at on this chart right here are pentatonic modes. Now, we don't have an awful lot to say about them. Whoops, wrong pen. Pentatonic modes. Now, one thing that you want to keep in mind is this. If you look at a pentatonic scale, if you look at the structure of a pentatonic scale up here at the top of the page, oops, we need to pan over just a little more. So I'll slide this over. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. With your 2 step and a half intervals between the 3 and the 5 and between the 6 and the 8. Of course, this scale would generate a system of modes right here. Now, how many modes would it have? Well, in a second, I'm going to tell you that even though a pentatonic scale has only 5 notes in it, the way we tend to use it in modern popular music is we tend to use it as if it has 7 modes. And in fact, a lot of you, some of the first scales that you ever learned to improvise. Remember that guy who was thinking, wow, I can play one scale over several different chords. A lot of you have started to learn to improvise not using the diatonic scales and their modes. Some of the first scales that you learn to improvise with are these pentatonic modes. Now, you thought, once again, that you were just playing a pentatonic scale over the multiple chords in these chord progressions. But once again, the truth of the matter is that isn't really what's happening. Yes, you are playing the pentatonic scale, but then depending on which chord in the chord progression you're playing over, you are using one or another of these various pentatonic modes. And what you're going to find out is that most of the time, pentatonic modes function in the songs we're playing pretty much the same way the diatonic modes do. And what I mean by that is, if you think about it, isn't a pentatonic scale, for the most part, isn't it pretty much just like a major diatonic scale with 2 notes left out? And what are the notes that we're actually leaving out? A major pentatonic scale is really pretty much like a major diatonic scale, except you're not playing the 4 and you're not playing the 7. The 4 and the 7 have been left out. An awful lot of times you use pentatonic modes in the same way that you use diatonic modes. It's just that you're playing with 2 fewer notes. You're leaving out the 4 and the 7 in this particular case. Now, I'm going to tell you this, I think that pentatonic scales are somewhat overrated, really, in the end. You're going to be hearing that, oh, and you might even be wondering, why is he spending so much time talking about these diatonic scales? I was under the impression that most rock and roll music and pop music really utilizes pentatonic scales. I don't see any evidence for that being as true as a lot of people would suggest. And the other thing to realize is, in so much music in the Western world, pentatonic scales are being used in exactly the same way that diatonic scales are. It's just that there's 2 notes being left out. In the case of mode number 1 here, you're skipping the 4 and the 7. Now, the question becomes, why do you want to leave those notes out? Well, there is to a certain degree certain good reasons for being careful with those notes. Once again, as we said, when you listen to the notes in these various scales over the different chords in the chord progression, you're going to find out that some sound better than others. And two notes that are rather difficult to control are the 4 and the 7. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to play on the piano a little bit now. Here, for example, is a C major chord on the piano right here. Actually, let me go up an octave if I can remember how to do that on this machine here. Transpose, and I'm going to go up. Transpose, that's what I want. And I'm going to go up 12 here. Here's a C major chord, right? Now, we've been led to believe that the notes in a C major scale will sound good over that chord, right? And if we listen to them, in fact, they do. Actually, I'm in better up here. All of those notes sounded pretty good over that chord, right? Part of the reason they all sounded as good as they did, though, is I played them fairly quickly. I didn't dwell on them for any period of time. What you're going to find out if you slow down and listen to each individual note in that scale, certain of the notes sound better than other ones. Like, how does the 1 note sound over this chord? The C itself. Sounds great, doesn't it? How about the G, which is the 5? Sounds great over that chord, doesn't it? Why? Because it's actually part of the chord itself. How about the 3, which is E? Sounds great, doesn't it? Because these are the actual notes that are in the chord. So let's say that the notes that are in the scale that are going to sound best with the chord are the notes that are actually in the scale that are also in the chord. Like, for example, this being a major chord, 1, 3, 5 will sound great. Some of these other notes in between, like the 2 and the 4 and the 6 and the 7, are not going to sound as good. Let's listen to the 2. You know, that's not, it's still a good note, particularly if you don't stay on it too long. But if you dwell on that 2, it's not going to be quite as good a note as the 1 or the 3 or the 5. Well, listen to the 4. The 4, in many ways, is like the worst. Boy, that note can sound downright sour, can't it? That is not the greatest melody note of all times. It's okay as long as you hit it and don't stay on it too long. But if you're going to dwell on that note right there, and these are the very things these are the very relationships you're trying to work out when you're playing with your Mode Jam tape. You're going to find yourself, if you're dwelling on that 4 and you're really listening to yourself, you're beginning your phrases and ending with your phrases with 4s and dwelling on them a long time, you're going to start going, oh, God, that doesn't really sound all that great. So, part of the reason that pentatonic players play the way they do is sometimes they think that they're leaving out notes that are going to give them more trouble. The 7 can also be kind of a little difficult note to control sometimes. But I say, just because it's a bit of a difficult note to control, I don't really see that as a particularly great reason for leaving it out. I really just challenge people to try to get in there and experiment with the 4 and learn how to use it. Another thing I'll mention at this point is that all this stuff that suggests that there are these absolute carved-in-stone chord scale relationships that involve leaving out certain notes out of our chromatic octave, all of that stuff is kind of an oversimplification. What you're going to find out later on is that the really clever players can use any one of the 12 notes anytime they want over any chord in any key. How do you like that? After all this time explaining to you that you must use this scale with this chord, I'm suggesting right now that that's all an oversimplification. And you might go, well, why did you tell me all this stuff then? Why didn't you tell me this in the beginning? Well, imagine this. What if I said, oh, you want to learn to improvise? Well, we'll play any note you want. You know, this is about control. It's about learning how to control this stuff. And so the way we generally learn to control these notes is by starting off with the ones that are going to give us the least trouble. So that's why a lot of people start with these pentatonic scales, where they leave out the troublesome notes like the 4 and the 7. But you don't want to stay there forever. I would like to see everybody graduate from being a pentatonic player to adding these additional 2 notes up here and becoming diatonic players, being able to control 7, 8 notes per octave. But then eventually all of us, I think, would like to then graduate beyond that to become totally chromatic players. But then when you start adding those other chromatic notes out there, then you have to be really careful how you use them. You have to put them in at just the right time. You have to get on them and get off them before people notice that it's a really strange sounding note. And people go, do I want to include strange sounding notes in my melodies? And the answer is yes, you do, because that's what really develops really interesting melodies, is using the conventional notes. But if all we ever used was the conventional notes, then things would get pretty boring. Here's an example, kind of a silly example. Listen to this. I'm sure you're familiar. Remember this old circus tune? Now, I'm in the key of C, and allegedly, if what I told you about diatonic harmony was correct, then I shouldn't be playing any black keys in this melody at all. I should be just playing the white keys on the piano, a C major scale, right? But no, so I shouldn't be playing any black keys at all. But here's a silly little example of a very clever little melody that you've all heard. That certainly in the key, it's in the key of C, but it uses almost all of the chromatic notes. It's that old circus thing, you know what I mean? Oops. Let me just play the melody because I'm having trouble getting both going. You know that melody, right? Now, look at that note right there. What if I dwelled on that note right there? It would sound pretty awful, wouldn't it? What if I dwelled on this note? It would sound pretty awful, wouldn't it? But I can write a very clever little melody. Oops. In which I use those notes, but I just get off them quickly. And that's where the really hot players can, the jazz guys and everything like that, they can get in and spiral all of those 12 notes around. But you can't really start there. You got to maybe start at this pentatonic level. That's where a lot of players do. But a lot of players never get beyond that, and they frankly just wind up boring me to death. There's an awful lot of people out there making millions of bucks that I don't necessarily buy their records, because it's just there is so much more out there that you can do. Now, the other thing I'm going to show you next week is people who play pentatonically kind of wind up shooting themselves in the foot, though, over time, because by leaving out these notes, you're not always leaving out the difficult notes to control. Sometimes you're leaving out some of the most powerful notes that you have at your disposal. For example, what if you're playing a 1-4-5 progression? And if we look at this right here, we know that this is going to be the 1 mode right there. And the 5 mode is this mode up here. We'll be looking at all these modes next week, but let me show you an example of what I'm talking about. Now, a 1-5 chord progression would be a pretty normal chord progression. So if you're playing pentatonically, doesn't that mean that you're going to be playing this mode quite often? Well, this is really functioning in the music the same way as the 5th diatonic music, which the 5th diatonic mode, which of course is Mixolydian, right? Mixolydian is a major scale with a flat 7 in it. All of those notes are pretty useful. So this 5th mode of the pentatonic scale, I actually call it pentatonic Mixolydian. These are the names, I just name them right after the diatonic scale. The 5th mode of the pentatonic scale I call pentatonic Mixolydian. In other words, it's like Mixolydian, except you're leaving out 2 notes. But in this particular case, what 2 notes are you leaving out by playing pentatonically? Well, you're leaving out that note right there, which turns out to be the 3. And you're also leaving out that note right there, which would have been in the 8 note per octave diatonic scale, which is flat 7. So, are these useless, ugly notes like the 4 and the 7 were up here? No, actually, these are like some of the most powerful notes that you have at your disposal. Doesn't note number 3 sound great over a major chord? And that flat 7 is a really cool bluesy note. So these pentatonic players are missing a lot of opportunities. That's a very powerful note that you would like to be able to control. That's a very powerful note that you would like to be able to control. Okay, now I'm going to tell you more about this stuff next week. We're also going to go on and look at a couple of other mode systems too, and we're also going to be getting into the subject of minor key music. Up until now, we've been learning that there are 12 different keys that you can play in, but it turns out there's just 12 different major keys. There's actually minor keys as well too, and we'll tell you what that means. So until then, I'm Scotty West. Have a great time. Get in there, get that Mode Jam tape going, and grab your finger charts. You got a lot of work to do. You got a lot of ear training to do too. But until then, have fun, okay? And we'll see you next week.